Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. Ukraine War news update, first part thereof really, for the 11th of June 2024. Let's get straight to where we normally start. Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveats apply, and you can find them in the description to my to the video below. Now, I was excoriated yesterday for saying, would you stop saying, casting doubt on these figures, and would you stop, talking about if you took 30% off, yada, yada, yada. Well, no, stop taking 30% off. So I just want to clarify, when I say, if I put if in front of something, I'm talking about a counterfactual, which means that if this was the case, then this would be the case. It's not, I believe that this is the case, so therefore this. Not at all. So what I'm saying is, if you are a pro-Russian propagandist, that I am not, even if you took 30% off this number, or actually I explained yesterday that 30% is way too much, and actually it should be like 15% at the top, right? So if you took sort of 15% off any of these numbers, you would still have an unsustainably high number, which means even if you are a Russian who is saying that these figures are inflated, I am not saying that. But if you are a Russian that's saying that, you're still in trouble. Okay, so I'm actually saying that no matter which position you're taking, Russia is in trouble. So don't have a go at me for saying, good, you believe X, Y, and Z. I don't. I'm presenting you with probabilities and different options. I'm very careful with my language. If you've learned anything over this last couple of years about myself, from a philosophical background, you have to be super careful when you're talking about what are supposedly factual claims and what is a fact, and basically everything's a probability assessment. So I tend to be careful with my language. And here's another example. So just make sure that you understand me. If you're going to criticize me, make sure you definitely are what's called steel manning me and not straw manning me. Build the best argument as to what I believe up before criticizing it, rather than the worst version of what I'm trying to say that's a straw man. So you build up a straw man, which is a poor version of the argument, and then you burn it down. Say, haha, I've defeated you or whatever. It's like, yeah, no. Anyway, 1,100 personnel lost is another high number. We are over 1,000. Yep, it's a slightly lower end of that very high range, so it's still hugely problematic. 23 tanks is a massive number in that category. Well over the that's double the daily average. 32 armored personnel vehicles and 46 artillery systems. Huge numbers in those categories. If we look at Bill's stats from yesterday, then it hasn't updated today because of the time zone difference. But if we look at the averages, the tank average is 8. That's the mean. Sorry, we're going for 9. So you got an average of 9 tanks. Where are we at? Armored fighting vehicles 14 and 13 artillery systems. So if we then plug that into where we're at here, 23 tanks, my goodness, that is well over double the average. Armored personnel vehicles, double the average, and goodness me, over triple the average for artillery systems. So 23, 32, and 46 are really high numbers in those categories. One multiple launch rocket system is going to help. 5 anti-aircraft warfare systems, wowzers, and that's going to be as a result of the strikes onto Crimea yesterday. That would have hit those S-300, 400 launchers and batteries, and goodness knows exactly what was taken out there. 1 aircraft, we're going to talk about that in a second, because there's actually now 2 aircraft that have been lost, although one was an accident. 58 vehicles and fuel tanks and 21 pieces of special equipment. Now, my guess is the special equipment might include things like radars. So when we have anti-aircraft warfare systems getting hit in Crimea, and we also had the claim that there are 4 radars taken out, I'm guessing that some of those components get added to the special equipment category. But I might be wrong. That's just my speculation there. It's a bad day at the office for the Russians, definitely yesterday. And I talked about how this is just not looking good. The prognosis is not good for Russia in terms of their air defense coverage, and what that may mean for Ukrainian strikes into to places like Crimea, but also Belgorod, and also well inside Russia to hit those critical infrastructure targets, or indeed air bases, etc., etc. Now, BBC and Mediazona, who have been doing these awesome bits of research in terms of how many Russians have definitely died in this war, and they've looked previously at obituaries, social media posts that declare certain people's deaths on account of the war, and as long as it's definitely connected to the war, it's quite a high bar that is set by the BBC Russia and Mediazona. If they can definitely know that someone has died as a result of the war, then they notch that one on the tally sheets, and the claims have been fairly extensive with regard to the Russian losses, but that is your absolute benchmark minimum. So although I would say they're extensive, many people would say, well, look at those BBC Russia statistics, they're not very high, are they? Well, actually, that's the very, very lowest they can be, and they don't include the DPR, they don't include the LPR, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Now they've done a great bit of research, and this is a fascinating read. The whole article is a really good read. It's in Russian, so if you just Google translate it. Immoral but effective, how and at what cost the Wagner PMC captured Bakhmut. So this is going back in time to see the capture of Bakhmut, and then it finds. So basically the headline really is, of the almost 20,000 Wagner mercenaries who died during the assault on Ukrainian Bakhmut, more than 17,000 were prisoners taken to the front from Russian colonies and pre-trial detention centres. BBC and Mediazona in the Russian Register of Foreign Agents gained access to the personal data of these people and found out that Yevgeny Prigozhin's statements about losses during the capture of the city, which were met even with disapproval by Z bloggers, were greatly embellished. One of the most famous videos with the founder of the Wagner PMC, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was filmed in May 2023. Against a background of 24 corpses of his fighters, Prigozhin shouts into the cell, Shoigu, Gerasimov, where is the ammunition? Then Prigozhin claimed that the heavy losses of mercenaries during the assault on Bakhmut were primarily due to the sluggishness of the Ministry of Defense and their lack of shells. But our data, so where he was embellishing is why they died, lack of data. But our data showed that Wagner suffered the highest daily losses, 213 people every day, much earlier in January 2023. There were claims that actually he didn't have that significant lack of artillery ammunition, and this was his way of just getting even more. Later, Prigozhin admitted that he killed 20 mercenaries in the battles for Bakhmut. I'm not sure what that means here. He claimed that only half of them were prisoners. During the operation, I selected 50,000 prisoners, of whom 20% died. Exactly the same number of them died as those who came to us under contract, without zones, Prigozhin said shortly after the capture of the city in an interview with pro-Kremlin political strategist Konstantin Dolgov. So this is, I think, where they're going as well with the embellishment, which is the proportion of the overall deaths that were prisoners compared to contract soldiers. Actually, the vast majority of them were prisoners. BBC and Mediazona received a complete list of the personnel data of 19,547 dead Wagner mercenaries, of whom 17,175 were not prisoners, as Prigozhin claimed, but 88%. So that is confusing, because that's actually a bit of a, I don't know, there's a translation issue from the auto translate. So that is actually that they were prisoners. So 17,001, it's the exact opposite. 17,175 were prisoners of the almost 20,000 that died. And that's 88% of them. So what it's saying is that what is not true is that as many prisoners died as contract soldiers, which is what Prigozhin claimed, and what appears to be true is a vast majority. In fact, there's your kind of pie chart thing. Vast majority of them were indeed prisoners. Lots of detail in here. We're just going to pick out. I'm just going to pick out a couple of bits and pieces, but it is a very interesting read. Wagner took most of the prisoners from the Krasnoyarsk IK6 of the strict regime. So that is here, I presume that you've got different areas that it took prisoners from, and you've got an infographic that's interactive there that you can look at. More than 500 people, the limit for filling this colony is 1,410 places. So from one single prison of 1,410, he took 500. And of those 500, 136 prisoners died. In second place by a wide margin is IK2 in the village of Dvubratsky, Krasnodar territory. From a high security institution designed for more than 2,000 places, Prigozhin took more than 340 prisoners, of whom 119 died. So you're looking at quite a large, significant proportion of the prisoners that were taken died. Now remember, on top of the died, if you operate at a 3-to-1 dead to wounded ratio, then that's all the people you've taken. Literally everyone is either dead or wounded if you operate at 3-to-1 dead to wounded. Now there are some saying that actually with the Russians the proportion is different because you've got such a high mortality rate that even if you do get injured you end up dying, and so it might be something like 2-to-1, which is not good. Like the further you get towards parity between dead and injured, the worse your prognosis is for getting injured. It's not that you're doing better. So what you really want is a dead to wounded ratio of 1-to-10, right? And then so most if you become a casualty, you've got a much smaller chance of dying, right? Rather than if you become a casualty, you've got a 50% chance of dying, right? So that's how to understand that. But these are not good stats for survivability for prisoners. The same number of convicts left the walls of IK3 in the Irkutsk region. 112 died, and the IK5 in the village of Startsevo in the Krasnoyarsk territory, where 102 people died. So you've got basically a third of the prisoners died, which means that you would have to have a died to wounded ratio. My goodness, if you had a 1-to-2 ratio, which is so your hold is 3, so a third of them, you got to know the difference between ratio and proportion. A 1-to-2 ratio would give you the entirety of your prisoners dead or injured. Wow. That is absolutely shocking. So these are really, really high mortality rates. 17,175 of them, that is 35% of the prisoners who went to the front, died. So again, if you've got a 1-to-2 ratio, that's everyone dead and injured. 35% of the people you took died is insane. This is an absolute shocker. According to the Wagner mercenaries themselves, those who were seriously injured, such as the loss of a leg or arm, and were carried off the battlefield, usually survived. But it was not easy to wait for this evacuation. According to the Wagner mercenaries, those who were injured usually survived. I don't know how seriously we can take that, whether that's just subjective, how empirical that opinion is, how justifiable it is. Assault infantry are not allowed to carry the wounded from the battlefield on their own, since their main task is to continue the assault until the goal is achieved. If the assault fails, retreat is allowed only at night, the Ukrainian intelligence report says. So in other words, the Ukrainians would disagree with this because it looks like if you're injured, you ain't getting rescued by your compatriots or your unit colleagues, if you like. They just have to continue going, especially when you've got barrier troops supposedly behind. Really brutal. And it talks about how brutal it was, but how kind of not clever, but it worked. It was immoral, but it was effective, and it got them Bakhmut effectively. But here you go, immoral but effective. Lots of data, lots of interesting nuggets in this. Look at the loss stats after October 2022. It said since mid-November, the weekly losses of PMCs had not fallen below 400 people, and 90% of them were prisoners. Just high losses. Judging judging by our data, in most of the sets of prisoners who were recruited during January, the survival rate was already 50% and not 75% as in the summer and autumn. So, 50%. Great. Gee whiz, 50%. Survival rate was 50%. Anyway, to be honest, this is genius, cruel, immoral, but effective tactics. It worked. The Ukrainian soldier who defended Bakhmut assessed the experience of facing wave attacks by Wagner prisoners. And that's the thing. When you don't care for the survivability of your troops, you can just send them in wave after wave. And of course, we remember at that time, there were Ukrainian units running out of ammunition, firing at these troops coming at them. Later, Prigozhin admitted that after the capture of Bakhmut, Wagner lost its combat potential, so the mercenaries were withdrawn from the front for respite and resupply. I remember arguing with trolls at the time that was the case, and they were denying it. It's like, no, literally what happened. They were done. And in fact, that was the end of Wagner. I believe that really precipitated Prigozhin's death, effectively. His experiences in Bakhmut and the anger that he took with him and the decisions getting made by the conventional military and Gerasimov. They took Bakhmut. And although it says that Bakhmut then became a staging ground for Chasiv Yar, personally, I think history would agree. I think the loss of Bakhmut, the Ukrainians losing Bakhmut, was actually a strategic victory. And I think the massive attrition of those troops and indeed effectively the death of Wagner was to the benefit of Ukraine. And I think the attrition rates were hugely beneficial to Ukraine. It says here, but the Bakhmut meat grinder cost both Russia and Ukraine dearly. It did cost Ukraine, but I think that those ratios were to the benefit of Ukraine. And that will sound horrible if you're the family of those people, friends and family of those people who died in Bakhmut, of course. But I think from a cold, distant, analytical view, I think Bakhmut served to really do in the Russian combat capacity. Military expert Jack Watling notes, quote, the Ukrainians managed to force Russia to spend huge forces to capture Bakhmut. At the same time, the armed forces of Ukraine suffered much fewer losses, and here's my point. But they were significantly more experienced servicemen than their opponents. And there's an interesting dynamic. So a lot of the troops fighting in Bakhmut were experienced, although there were a lot of newbies that were brought in, but that's probably because the experienced troops had been attrited. It turns out that in the battle for Bakhmut, Ukraine lost more experienced fighters than Russia. I guess that is an interesting way of looking at the Russians were losing at a much greater ratio, but they were swapping prisoners for experienced Russian fighters, for experienced Ukrainian fighters. So that's probably something I hadn't considered so much previously. I was thinking previously on a purely mathematical scale. Yeah, okay, there's something to consider. I'll have to go back and think on that. But I still think, the end of Wagner and the end of Prigozhin has been a really useful thing for Ukraine, for sure. Now, friendly fire, Belgorod station here, reporting in the region, a state TV channel, propagandist. So this is actually caught on camera as well. I've seen this. Along with 3 Russian soldiers were blown up by a landmine, and it would have been one of their own. So it's kind of friendly fire. It's pretty hardcore, that, and you can see the effects of that. All 4 survived, but the injuries are of varying degrees, and you can actually see one of the men being cared for as he has quite a few wounds there. So propagandists coming out into the field and then getting a taste of proper war there. Now, Ukraine has shot down a Russian plane in Donetsk. It's a Su-25. That's probably the one you see on the list, almost certainly, actually. So that's in battles around Pokrovsk, which is the Avdiivka direction. So that's really good news. The Russians lost another fighter jet just today. So this was, I think, in the early hours of this morning, maybe. It crashed due to technical malfunction, by all accounts, and both crew members did not survive. So that's in North Ossetia, on the way to Georgia there. And so two aircraft lost in quick succession, and that's going to hurt the Russians there, not just in terms of the planes themselves, as I often say, but the crew, maybe even more importantly. Russian Su-34 crashed in North Ossetia, crew died, and that's been reported by Russian media, so that seems to be fairly kosher as well. Right, the Navy of the Ukrainian Navy reported last night, and there's quite a lot of chatter about this, that a Russian large anti-submarine ship, the Admiral Levchenko, was on fire in the Barents Sea. This is nowhere near Ukraine, obviously, Barents Straits and whatever. The ship could be carrying several hundred crew. This was reported by the Speaker of the Navy, the Ukrainians, Dmitry Platenchuk. He said that the cause of the fire was a malfunction in one of the engines. But yeah, there was quite a lot of talk about that. I don't know what the outcome was, but it seems like one of the Russian ships was on fire. Now, there is more confirmation that 2 Su-57s were damaged at the strike on Akhtubinsk the other night. The Su-57 is a fifth-generation fighter that the Russians have, although they don't have very many and don't seem to be very good. In order to not to get up twice, I will say that 2 Su-57s were damaged. The second Su-57 received minor damage, which will be repaired on site. This is from fighter bomber who is a pretty reliable Russian pilot source. I already wrote about the first one. They will think it would be advisable to restore it or not, because the board is really a prototype and is of little use for combat. Of the 3 drones that attacked the airfield, all 3 made it. For what reasons the air defense did not work, I will not write. Let the majors figure out the reasons and how it happened. The only rebuff the drone tried to give was a detachment that shot 2 magazines at them and then spent the whole morning collecting cartridges around the airfield. So there you go. Failed air defenses, and we talked about the issue that Russia has with air defenses, being such a large country and having their own air defense batteries be absolutely hammered in Crimea and Belgorod, and losing air defense pieces like books 10 a penny at the moment. It's just, yeah, quite incredible. Right, and indeed, talking of that, there is a confirmation coming through as well from satellite imagery. The claim is that 10 ATACMS got through, 10 to 12. 2 S-300s were damaged, 4 radars were damaged. Saki was hit with 4 ATACMS. Some saying, 4 radars, 2 S-300s. Some saying maybe another S-300, S-400. So there was a lot of destruction on Crimea 2 nights ago. That's not last night, it's 2 nights ago still. Reports that all the S-300 PMU in this photo around Tarkankut have been destroyed. So, when we go back to look at the stats here, when you've got 5 anti-aircraft warfare systems and then 21 pieces of special equipment, it could be that these pieces are spread throughout those 2 categories. I'm not sure though. Images after Ukraine's ATACMS strike on one of the reported radar stations in Jankoy in Crimea. So here you have a radar station that is then very much burnt. So it's quite a significant patch of area, a patch of grassland and scrub that has been burnt by the strike. So what is this? Ben Hodges saying, important part of the effort, destruction of the bridge and are when the Ukrainian Air Force and HUR, so Special Forces and whatnot, are ready to isolate Crimea from Russia, a precursor to the eventual liberation of Crimea. So Ben Hodges back to talking, and I mentioned this in my frontline update, that could you get an attack on Crimea? I don't know whether it's likely at all, whether it would be quite suicidal or not. Some people saying no, it's never going to happen. But you could have this destruction of enemy air defenses. You've got your SEAD and DIAD operations that take out your air defenses so that you can have air superiority or at least air advantage to then commit to other things like close air support, but also possibly an attack directly onto Crimea with an amphibious landing or an air assault or both at the same time. They are also doing, the Ukrainians, other things. So there was possibly this strike on an amphibious ship that's then since been denied that a landing ship was hit. And then you have the claims that a tug was hit and a barge was hit. Things have been happening in the Sea of Azov, which is that sea between Crimea and Rostov and Donetsk, up in that top right-hand corner of the Black Sea. It's been, I don't know what has actually been hit and sunk. There's an oil slick reported, a disappearing ship on the, I guess, transponders or satellite imagery or whatever it is. But yeah, stuff has happened, just don't quite know. This meant to be back in the personnel section of Russian 41st Motorized Rifle Regiment. I reported this last night in my frontline update. Has completely lost its combat capability, according to social networks. After the regiment was defeated in Vovchansk region and its soldiers were captured, the unit was withdrawn from the territory of Ukraine. The occupiers allegedly accused the Russian military group North and its commander, General Lapin, of incompetence on their personal public pages. Now, Lapin was already someone of very low reckoning. He was someone who failed previously in the war, was kind of moved sideways, and has now been put in charge of this attack to the north, which has been an absolute disaster. What do you expect, given that it seemed a fairly brainless attack and you're using a fairly incompetent general? And lo and behold, this particular unit has been withdrawn because they've been decimated. I don't know if that's in the right place, actually. There we go. That was it. So there's been another assassination. There's been a number of assassination attempts and some successful recently. Police say Maxim Denschik was shot 4 times as he left his apartment. He used to be the director for legal support in the city of Zaporizhia, but in May he was suspended pending an investigation. So a local councillor in Zaporizhia has been assassinated. I don't know if that is Zaporizhia Oblast, so he's in occupied territories. That's what I presume there, rather than Zaporizhia city, which is in the free part of Zaporizhia. There's been an explosion at the roof of the Palace of Arts in the Russian city of Ivanovo. Heavy fire started, so Russia on fire again. Another example, in fact, there were 2 examples yesterday. Another big fire in the town of Yerzovka, 25 kilometers north of Volgograd, on the banks of the Volga River. It's just, these big fires are happening so often, it's absolutely incredible. Right, moving on to strikes. It seemed to be a very quiet night, but there were things that took place, and sometimes we hear very slowly about these. The information filters through. Chonghar, which is one of the 3 ways of getting onto Crimea. You've got basically Henichesk, which takes you down that spit, this bar that comes, that sandbar that comes down the eastern side of Ukraine. Of Crimea. Then you get Chonhar, and then you get Perekrop here. So Chonhar has a railway bridge and a road bridge. They've both been targeted before and hit by storm shadows, as far as I remember. Then there are explosions around there last night. Who knows what was targeted and how, but expect to see maybe something later today. This is from yesterday, but it came out later during the day that there was an alarm in Yaroslav at night. Drones attacked the local refinery. Don't know any details about whether there was any damage to the refinery there, but that was 2 nights ago. But yeah, didn't know that until yesterday daytime. Then Bryansk there seems to have been a big explosion in Bryansk. In Belgorod. Another strike. There have been some really big strikes on military bases and obviously S-400, 300 systems and military equipment, but also these staging points for the Russian attack into Kharkiv. And there appears to be another one there just this morning. And this appears to be the damage done by the airstrike, is the claim here. Photo from what's believed to be Ukraine's first airstrike inside Russia. And of course, I said yesterday that actually is not true, because there are those airstrikes, helicopter and fixed-wing airstrikes right at the beginning of the war, when they did some really risky things going into Russia. But since then, I guess the point is this is the first proper airstrike, because permission has now been given. The thought is that this was a strike on a command post, and 8 Russian officers may have died in that attack, and they would have been part of the Vovchansk grouping of units and whatnot. So could have been a significant high-level command post attack. Russia has also supposedly bombed its own people. 88 times in the last 100 days. So there are missile and bomb failures that happen, it appears, far more often on the Russian side than the Ukrainian side. That's a lot of, and that's the Russian media outlet Astra have been monitoring the failures. They found the 88th aerial bomb in 100 days that's failed to reach its target. That might actually be bomb rather than missiles, because there are also a number of Caliber missiles that do not reach their target either and fall in Russian territories. And Jakub Janowski here actually reporting from, or taking an excerpt from Justin Bronk. Kiev appears to be pursuing a clear strategy to force the VKS, that's the Russian Air Force, to either vacate its bases within several hundred miles of Ukraine's borders or dedicate an inordinate quantity of air defense systems to defending them. This is exactly what I was talking about yesterday and previously, which is that Russia is a huge country. It's had its air defense systems attrited to a critical level, I would argue, and they don't have enough air defense systems to protect inside the occupied territories of Ukraine, let alone inside Russia as a whole, and the massive country and all of those strategic infrastructural targets that could be hit, like oil refineries, air bases, munitions factories, all of that kind of stuff. They just don't have the air defenses. So what do? And Crimea's had its air defense systems absolutely obliterated recently. Do they bring in more air defenses, or do they just give up and move back behind drone and ATACMS reach? Or of course, drones can now reach 1,600 kilometers or whatever it is. So, okay, back behind ATACMS reach. That seems to be the major issue they have, just being unable to shoot down these ATACMS. So we could have a 300 kilometer range, just like when the HIMARS arrived and you had 84 kilometers and so of range of their missiles. So you had the Russians moving all of their critical depots and air bases behind 100 kilometers behind front lines. Well, now 300 kilometers appears to be the new number. It's a real problem the Russians have, because they can't do nearly so well. It's not nearly as efficient logistically, and also in terms of costs, to prosecute a war where you have to do it from 300 kilometers behind the front line. Okay. Partisan movement Atesh reports that, and this is exactly along the same line of thinking, and this is what I reported yesterday in my frontline update, but it's has its home here in the hits and losses. Partisan movement Atesh reports, so it's the Crimean partisan movement predominantly, that Russian armed forces air defense servicemen in Crimea have been instructed to evacuate their families to military camps in the southern military district. The directive coincides with the relocation of air defense systems to the Belgorod region. So they're moving air defense systems from Crimea to Belgorod, what they've got left, it seems, raising security concerns in occupied Crimea due to reduced coverage. Additionally, the Russian military is forming new mobile air defense teams using Zu-23-2s. These are 23mm cannons that you see on the back of Ural trucks and whatnot. A very poor cousin of, say, the Gepard. So the Gepard is a tracked vehicle with a radar that moves around and can do a really good job of shooting, particularly drones out the air, but cruise missiles as well, at a 5-kilometer range. Well, you got the poor cousin here being the primary method of doing air defense around Crimea, which is an incredibly strategically important place, and they seem to have run out of S-300s and 400s due to massive attrition, and instead using these cannons, while the air defense teams, crews and their families are being more ordered out to go and live somewhere else or operate somewhere else. It's incredible. So we've seen the Black Sea Fleet move from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, and now we're seeing the air defense teams move from Crimea to elsewhere. Crimea becomes untenable. So even if you don't take Crimea, you've rendered it impotent as a place, indicating a strategic shift towards this area with a reduced focus on occupied Crimea. Wow. Okay, Andrew Perpetua says exactly what I... Oh, no. Sorry. this is not his view on Kharkiv, which is aligned with my view, but actually he said something about Avdiivka, which is something I've also said, that they've slowed down, they have grinding successes there, and considering how quickly they took the main part of Avdiivka when they did that counterattack, it is less than impressive at the moment. He said, I'm genuinely surprised by how little Russia has managed to take west of Avdiivka. I expected them to move much further, especially north of Ocheritina and west of Pobieda. We'll see this on a map later in my mapping update. In my opinion, it shows a weakness of the Russian military that they were unable to exploit capturing Avdiivka. And as an aside, it's becoming increasingly amusing to me personally how the pro-Russian analysts out there are starting to have these little mini meltdowns regarding Russia's inability to exploit any small victories they achieve. We've seen time and time again that Russia has the numerical superiority to capture key Ukrainian defensive positions, but not the strength to continue moving once a position is taken. So Russia keeps entering this cycle where they have huge grinding battles. Think Novomykhailivka, think Krasnohorivka, which is still going on, think Chasiv Yar, think Avdiivka, and so on and so forth. So Russia keeps entering the cycle where they have these huge grinding battles where they suffer huge attrition, but never the breakthrough on the other side to justify the losses. They go from one huge attritional battle to the next in sequence. So, you take Novomykhailivka, then you go on to a grinding battle over the next place, Konstantinivka, and you grind that one out, and then you go to the next place, and then before you know it, you've got nothing left. And we're getting to the point where Russia is starting to have nothing left. Those stockpiles back in Russia, those big equipment stockpiles, are really drastically low. They just go from one huge attritional battle to the next in sequence, which is how they end up losing thousands of vehicles. This, honestly, that is a super important synopsis that Andrew's given there. And the Z bloggers, these Russian bloggers, are panicking. If you listen to what they're saying, they're worrying about increased potential of NATO missile defenses, provocation through enemy air strikes at strategic and tactically important links. Over the next 6 months, work will be carried out on our remaining air defense systems and complexes. They will be put out of action. Probing of possibilities has been carried out since the beginning of 2023. So this is, what you've seen in Crimea will just continue. Like I said yesterday, this is now what the Russians are saying. I said they're just going to, it will be a snowball, because the more you attrit the air defenses, the less able they are to take out the very things that are attritting them. And you then move on to the lower and lower value stuff. So if you're blowing up S-400 Triumph systems in the very best Russian air defenses and radars with ATACMS that are 40 years old, then once you've got rid of those, you're moving on to the next level of air defense, which will be even less able to take out those ATACMS, and so on and so forth. And this is what's over the next 6 months. Work will be carried out on our remaining air defenses. In 6 months, when the roads become muddy and the effectiveness of the ground forces, both the Ukrainian and ours, decreases, the build-up of strike aviation potential F-16s will be delivered. Will begin at the airfields of Poland, Germany, Finland, Sweden, etc. In 6 months, it will be very difficult for the boys like Uncle Vanya, because their Ukrainian aviation will start operating, and it doesn't matter who will be the pilots. We have 6 months to make important decisions, and despite all of this, not a single airfield is protected. So even though we know things are tough and air defense is getting attrited, we are still not building protective hangars for our planes, and they're getting hit by drones. This is why I'm getting more and more positive as the days go by at the moment, because these kind of opinions that Andrew is advocating appear to be absolutely on point, and the Russians are panicking, and it's not sounding good. Meanwhile, Deputy Chief Commander of Ukraine's Armed Forces has been appointed a commander of a new unmanned systems forces. So at the same time, Ukraine is creating new capabilities. We have an unmanned systems forces, so that is, whether that means just drones or whether we're talking about autonomous drones as well, that's unmanned systems. So I think we're looking at AI, we're looking at all sorts of increased capability potential for the Ukrainians. Fascinating. Another random nugget here, but I find this fascinating because I think we are in an information war, as I keep saying. Rebar has opened it's a Rebar, the pro-Russian propagandist source that toes the party line with the MED broadly, sometimes is critical, but very much in line with it. Rebar opens a media school in Kyrgyzstan. Today in Bishkek, the Bishkek, head of Rebar, held a lecture of students in the Kyrgyz National University on the real value of Telegram and the nuances of problem solving in the information sphere. This is just the first lecture in a series of speeches in local media and advanced training for Kyrgyz media staff, students, local PR and press services starting June the 17th. And this sentence I love. Starting June the 17th, we are launching a 1-month full-time course to train a new wave of opinion leaders. Manipulating opinion. We are leading you in what opinion you should have as a public, and we are going to give lectures on how to use Telegram and use social media in order to do that. We will train specialists who work with text, sound and video, and the ultimate goal to launch bright new projects, develop and support them, including on a grant basis to develop and strengthen local Kyrgyz journalism or local Kyrgyz state opinion that we want the electorate to have. What we see today is a complete lack of military, political and industry expertise, as well as a virtual vacuum in the blogosphere and opinion journalism in Kyrgyzstan. Our goal is to help who? And that's why we are opening Rebar Media School in Kyrgyzstan. You're certainly not helping the general public to have a free and fair information space that they have the tools to dissect, so that they can derive some truth from the BS that's being thrown at them. You are setting out to allow people in Kyrgyzstan to manipulate the electorate. Finally, there's been a derailment reported in Russia. It happened yesterday at the Luzhskaya station. No one seems to know how 5 tanks overturned while performing shunting work, but they did. So there you go. That's good news for the Ukrainians, because that will stop stuff moving. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thanks for watching. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.